Why do a video about Wes Streeting, a man who's somehow less photogenic than Keir Starmer, a man who in any other country wouldn't be elected as a dog catcher? Because I love weird guys who are in politics, and there's no one who oozes weirdness more than Wes Streeting. In a parliament filled with wannabe boxers, people who've been radicalized by right-wing YouTubers, alleged sex criminals, and Ed Davey, Wes Streeting stands out. There's just something captivatingly odd about him as a character, even if his political trajectory is typical of his particular faction within the Labour Party and British politics. The historic tweets about all sorts of topics, but in particular I enjoy the ones about McDonald's, and the occasional outburst on social media are highlights, but he's just a fucking weirdo. So the guy's weird. So what? There are plenty of strange people in Parliament, and that doesn't mean they deserve their own video. Well, Wes Streeting is different. First, he's the current Health Secretary, which means that he's in charge of the NHS and social care, arguably one of the most important roles in government. Second, if you believe the odds, Wes Streeting is the most likely person to become the next Labour leader, or at least among the favourites. I think Keir Starmer will resign before an election, which means that he's possibly going to become Prime Minister. Yes, Wes Streeting is quite likely to become Prime Minister. My final point along this line is that if various books and media reports are to be believed, he's the preferred successor of Morgan McSweeney, Keir Starmer's Chief of Staff, and the power behind the throne, at least in terms of the Starmer project, such that it is. So the political forces in the Labour Party are leaning his way, which makes him inherently worthy of discussion. He's possibly the UK's next Prime Minister, despite being, as we'll see, something of a lightweight and a joke. I'm also here to disabuse people of certain notions about Wes Streeting. I've seen it said many times, often by centrists, but not exclusively, that Wes Streeting is one of, if not the best political communicators in Britain. If you are a centrist and you're watching this, I want you to know that for once, I don't mean that as a hostile term, but just categorical, and I want you to pay attention here. If Wes Streeting is the best, or one of the best political communicators in the country, we have a serious problem. Just as an example, I'll show you this attempt to give advice to pensioners who were worried about the winter fuel allowance cuts to just whet your appetite.
What's your advice to pensioners who are frightened about the forthcoming winter?
Well, two things. Firstly, the winter fuel allowance is being means tested to support the poorest pensioners. We've also extended things like the warm homes discount,
So what's your advice?
And the hardship support. But the other advice I would give is, like, in terms of the triple lock, we're committed to that. That means that pensioners will
That's
be
not
better.
advice.
But pensioners will be better off next winter and the winter after than they were last winter because we've committed to the triple lock. Like,
Only if
people
they're
will
on the
still
new,
be,
only if
still
they're
be
on the
better
new
off.
state pension, and most people aren't on a new state pension.
And this exceptionally long, clumsy, and frankly unnecessary political metaphor he used about a ship that I won't play all the way through, it will just be in the background. But my god, just say the only reason we still have a ship is because of Keir Starmer. You don't have to show off how well you understand the golden age of piracy here. So not only is he a potential successor to Keir Starmer, he's also someone who's having a political mythology built up about him that will probably dissolve on first contact with concentrated press attention. Which is very funny, but one thing I'm getting a little tired of is people being confused about how this happens and reflexively blaming press coverage or bias. Those things are issues. I may have even talked about them on the channel before, but sometimes the emperor really does have no clothes. Wes Streeting is probably the worst high-profile frontbencher currently on the government side. There are arguments to be made for Liz Kendall and Rachel Reeves as worse, and while both are contributing to the government's ongoing program of social murder, in order to appease the line that must never be allowed to be made sad, no one in the press is really touting either of these two as potential prime ministers. In Liz Kendall's case, that's because she can barely string a sentence together without flying into a rage about the prospect of a disabled person owning a TV. And in Reeves' case, it's because she's completely out of her depth and possibly a fraud. It's never really been clarified. Also, because the Labour Party is never going to elect a woman as its leader, they'll literally take any excuse not to do so. In those cases, though, I would argue Liz Kendall has a talent for brutalizing the poor, and Rachel Reeves is basically holding herself hostage. Wes Streeting is a powerful combination of being a true believer, corrupt, a dickhead, and unable to communicate without unsettling at least half the country. A good example is the time he insisted his suggested policy of mandatory weight loss jabs for the unemployed was not dystopian, which I promise we'll talk about a bit later, but there's no way to look at that headline and picture combination and not conclude that something dystopian is going on. He's also in the pocket of private healthcare, with 60% of his declared donations coming from companies and individuals linked to private healthcare, which makes all his talk of reform to the NHS feel like a barely disguised code. So he is just relentlessly incompetent, corrupt, and cruel, a toxic combination of traits that makes his promotion by sections of the press concerning, to put it mildly. Really, the only thing I need to say about Wes Streeting is what Dawn Foster said about him in this message, calling him a right-wing lickspittle cunt. That's really all he is. His particular political journey may be emblematic of his particular tendency within Labour, but that's what it boils down to. So this video is going to be structured in a particular way, partially chronologically, partially thematic, which means you ought to be able to use the timestamps to find your way around pretty easily and have an idea of where you are. Feel free to jump around and dip in and out. I know it's a bit longer than my recent output. There's no hard feelings if you're just here for a specific part of his career. It's fine, really. With that, let's start the story at the beginning with this and what Wes Streeting was up to before he was an MP. Much like in my first video about Keir Starmer, I think there's value in looking at the pre-Parliament career of Wes Streeting, just to get a sense of where he comes from and how he's ended up as one of the most right-wing members of one of the most right-wing cabinets Labour and Britain has ever produced. Normally, we'd have to sift through a bunch of articles where his past was brought up, and if he was someone newsworthy, we'd have to find some articles about him. For example, his time as NUS president would be a treasure trove. We will do a little bit of that, but I couldn't resist this. It's Wes Streeting's autobiography covering his life up until his election to Parliament. Now, one might say it's ambitious for a man who was 39 at the time of publication to release an autobiography that covers his life up to age 32, and it possibly is. He justifies this by using his diagnosis and treatment for cancer as motivation to write it, and purely in the abstract, I kind of respect it. Arguably, it's a lot healthier than a lot of the other responses you could have to that. On the other hand, and I don't like to say this, this book is kind of dog shit. The worst combination of someone trying to construct a political mythology about themselves and a person who clearly doesn't have any substance about them, whether politically or in terms of being an interesting person, which speaks to something I think goes unacknowledged about books written by politicians. They're not usually for the general public. Like, Wes Streeting didn't write this and think, oh, I can't wait for Esque the Crusader, or Barry Down the Pub, or those nans I'm gonna freeze to read this. Often books by politicians are actually written for their colleagues and for political journalists. Not that they'll mind if the public do engage with their work, of course. As I just said, it's a way for him to transmit the political myth he wants those people to repeat about him, either when he inevitably attempts his leadership bid or when the press report on him more generally. For me, this makes this book, terrible though it is, important in understanding Wes Streeting. It's telling us how he wants to be seen by the people who matter. There was and still is this tendency among politicians to lean into their upbringing and background, both as a way to bolster their political mythology and to justify certain positions. It's not helped by the fact that the UK press is seemingly obsessed with class while not really understanding it very well. You can see this clip from Sky News, how Streeting has used his background in this clip to provide cover for policies that will harm people who are growing up in similar conditions to him.
You know, I'm in many respects a product of the welfare system and a product of what an effective state could be. When I was growing up, the welfare system put food in the fridge and money in the electric meter. We had a council house, and a state education gave me every opportunity to be now sat in front of you today as a government minister responsible for our NHS and social care services.
There's a book called Authentocrats that covers this. It's quite good on the topic, and an Authentocrat is exactly how I would describe Streeting and what he's doing in this book. He has the dream background for an Authentocrat, though it is worth noting that while he doesn't shy away from his background, either in media interviews or in the book, he does talk about his shame about being in poverty and how he kind of did what I did, which was to never really look back once you left home. Now, my background is very different to his, but I think this notion of him having escaped has informed a lot of his politics. I mean, chapter 12 in this book is literally called The Great Escape and features both him working at McDonald's and reading a book by Tony Blair. Things I wish I could escape about Wes Streeting, but I'm the one who decided to do this video. I can't even blame the patrons and members for this one because I picked the topic. I hate myself sometimes. There's a fatal flaw which we all fall into, which is that we assume our experience is the default. There's this tendency about people who have managed to break through class barriers, as he did, in order to end up at Cambridge Uni, to just assume that others have failed because they lacked your brilliance or your work ethic, rather than you being exceptionally fortunate. That's not to say that if you go from a background defined by poverty and instability, as Wes clearly has according to the book, to health secretary, that there isn't a lot of hard work behind it. It's just that when you're the exception, it's worth understanding not just that you are the exception, which Wes does understand, I think, but why. I don't want to put anything on him, but it does feel like he doesn't want to look directly at that. Back to his Authentocrat background for a second here. He has almost a perfect story in this respect. He has Tory family members. He grew up in poverty. He inherited a devout, by British standards, because Britain is very culturally secular, attitude towards Christianity, and was at the sharp end of policies and issues that he now supports and exacerbates. It's really just perfect, a true imagining of what the typical salt of the earth Brit is like. Now, I have no cause to doubt that he's being truthful in that description of his background, and there are stories that he tells here that are things I wouldn't wish on anyone, which makes me wonder why he wishes them upon others. Why does he create the conditions that make those things more likely? There's a particular quote on page 98 that absolutely drove me up the wall, where he says, "I've always been conscious of the fact that many people feel more like victims of the state than supported by it," in reference to his mum having her benefits arbitrarily cut. Like, yeah, Wes, did you suddenly decide that now you're the one victimizing people? It's suddenly okay? Is that what happened? Something interesting about the issues he faced as a child and the problems he points to, like council housing, poor benefits, a cruel and humiliating welfare system, troubled schools, and just general struggle, is that they're the same problems we face now. It actually reminded me of yet another book, which I have prepared. This one, written in the 70s by a possibly British, but I suspect married to a Czechoslovak, but I'm not 100% sure, author Jean Ruppeldtova, called British Life and Institutions, which I'm 90% sure is a book written for Czech spies. Regardless, the interesting thing about this book is all of the problems that Britain has they're the same as they are now. And it's interesting to see that corroborated through Wes Streeting's book, which largely covers the 80s and 90s with his childhood. Anyway, I just wanted to show off this cool old book that my ex bought me from a used bookshop in Prague. It's really good. I don't know if you can find this anywhere, but if you can, I recommend it. It's quite interesting. My point is, it's kind of weird to have experienced these long-term problems and come out of it more proud of your escape while posing as someone who wants to make life easier for people from your background. I think it inevitably leads to policy focused on what broadly call social mobility, which intends to make escape easier rather than, making the conditions better. Like, for all of his faults, there are good observations in here. Like one about how sometimes in order to get a good job, you need to already have money. So just give people more money, Wes. It's not fucking rocket science, is it, mate? That's what really stands out about his childhood and the way he remembers it, which covers up to chapter 13 of the book, an overwhelming majority. He regularly laments the conditions he grew up in, how ashamed he was made to feel, how hard he had to work to escape it, but there's no real reflection on it. It always goes something like, here's a bad condition I had to deal with growing up, and here's how I, the protagonist of reality, overcame it, and then that's it. No real lessons drawn. There's always credit to exceptional individuals around him. Every 6 or 7 pages or so, you get something like this. For example, he was fortunate enough to have good teachers who supported him throughout his childhood. But does that perhaps lead to the epiphany that we should create the conditions for everyone to have such good teachers? Only in a kind of glancing way. I will also say that the vibe I got, and maybe this isn't fair, is that Wes Streeting is the kind of classic, I got bullied as a kid and now I'm taking it out on everyone else character. Though I will say that I think anyone who went to a British school of any kind would pretty much come off like that if they wrote a book where 81% of the chapters cover their childhood. So take that with a pinch of salt, but the boot does kind of fit if you ask me. Wes went to Cambridge Uni, which for someone from his background is a big deal, to grossly understate it. One of the things that's apparent throughout the chapter on his time at university, and a little bit before he goes there, since the process of getting in involves interviews and all of this stuff as well, right? It's just how these institutions capture you. Like, there's a part where Wes, despite being from a different background, despite having to work at McDonald's, incidentally, so just, if you're keeping track of how often he's taking the clown shilling, there you go, to supplement his student loan in order to live at uni, is kind of sucked into the elite institution and captured by it, partially because these kinds of institutions overwhelm you, but also because he had the great realization that people were nice to him. Wow. Now, I don't want to be too critical here, because there's a pattern of thought we all fall into, which is that we like to believe that we're uniquely immune to being captured in this way, or, immune to propaganda or whatever. And it's a comforting thought to believe that we're all simply built different. But there is an important lesson for us generally. This is how these institutions work. It's part of how they sustain themselves when they're so obviously relics of the past. Like, you don't get people defending drinking out of skulls without being captured by a culture. Now, to be clear, I'm not saying that Wes Streeting defended this specific incident. It is just an illustrative example. It's also at university where he becomes a student politician, a role he embodies to this day, a vicious, low-stakes style of politics that's rooted more in posturing to earn rhetorical victories in the moment than actually be coherent and achieve much of anything. At least that's the stereotype. I think it applies more to Wes than the people he tries to apply this to in the book. No surprises for guessing, it's the left. He immediately became so anti-left that he rejoined Labour, a party he explained that he'd left earlier. In fact, he goes to great lengths to explain how anti-Blair he was. He loves talking about that, which is going to be relevant shortly. There is one absolutely amazing quote about Labour students that he drops that I want to highlight, which is, contrary to being terrible careerists, they struck me as people who really believed in working for change and proud to wear their politics on their sleeves, which, if you've ever met anyone who was in Labour students, is an incredible statement, especially from the king of careerists biography. I have to hand it to Wes. It really actually made me laugh, though I suspect it wasn't intended to be comedic. It's at this point we see Wes engage with the NUS, which is the National Union of Students, which he describes as a great opportunity, which, given how his career has panned out, it's somewhat hard to argue with that description. It's just maybe a bit funny to follow up a bit about people not being careerists with those exact words. I'm not kidding, by the way, it's literally the next sentence after the careerist quote. This is one of the things that informs this general impression I get, especially in chapter 14, which is that Wes Streeting loved nothing more than the platform after he became NUS president. He talks about how he found himself on the BBC, Sky News, writing in The Guardian, and while he does talk in limited detail about some of the things he got up to, it's interesting what he omits from his time at the NUS. I'll give you two examples. Firstly, he omits that he was part of the NUS at the time he was the vice president for education, when the NUS dropped its support for free education, which informed his later position where he supported a kind of progressive graduate tax in order to fund higher education, which is not a good policy. Just make it fucking free. It's not hard. It's just interesting that he routinely complained in the book about fees and how hard it was to live on the student loan. You know, that's why he took the clown shilling, but was part of the organization when it moved towards embracing those exact policies. It's also interesting that he omits the time when he was president of the NUS that he voted to censure the NUS's Black Students Officer for not wanting to platform the BNP. For context, this was in 2010, around the time the BNP would have had its most successful general election performance, and after its unfortunately successful European election performance. Now, there are some details to the story where some specifics that the person who was censured got wrong, but it is interesting that Wes Streeting thought it was more important to performatively punish a black woman than support opposition to platforming fascists. There are three things I want to highlight about Wes's employment or volunteering that I think do tell us something interesting or will be relevant as we go on. Obviously, I've had a lot of fun about him working for McDonald's, but that's just a job some people have. One you would think would inform a gentler attitude towards workers' rights and organising than Wes Streeting has demonstrated in his time on the front bench, but what can you do? The really important stuff comes around this time he's NUS president. Firstly, he volunteered on David Miliband's leadership campaign, beginning the habit of a lifetime of aligning with the right of the Labour Party. There's something he's doing here in bringing that association up. David Miliband has been the prince across the water since he lost to his brother in the 2010 Labour leadership election. It's not uncommon among both Labour right types and an awful lot of liberals to say that the wrong Miliband won. And this, to me, reads as him signalling that he was on the right side of that divide. I won't be getting too deep into David Miliband here, in this narrative around him, just because that could be a video of its own, and not one I really want to make, to be honest. The other important employment he mentioned is he joined a group called Progress, which he describes in the book as a Labour supporting think tank and magazine, which is technically true. But it does hide some things from a casual reader, which is that Progress was the Blairite think tank. It was, to the extent that there was anything intellectual about Blairism, one of its intellectual engines. This tells us which particular side of the Labour right he was always aligned with. And yes, they have different factions, and the direction of this particular type of Labour person has taken is the same as Wes Streeting's journey, if you like. namely that Progress was by and large an economically centre-right faction, but one that was relaxed about civil rights. It wasn't progressive or radical, but by and large, if you were on the right of the party and you didn't want to make being gay illegal, Progress was where you'd end up. This is in contrast to what's called the old Labour right, who are much more rooted in a kind of socially conservative tradition that emerges from a lot of the trade unions. Basically, Progress was the sort of slick, urban, professional outfit. I don't know why I'm pointing at myself like I fucking embody any of that, but whatever. One for the ambitious types like Wes Streeting to use as an incubator for their careers and make connections, something he emphasises as soon as he's away from his childhood. The final employment that he brings up is his time at Stonewall, which is the UK's largest pro-LGBTQ+ charity. Often whenever Wes Streeting is doing his usual support for transphobia, articles will always mention that he was employed by them, and he is keen to associate himself with the legacy of Stonewall. He specifically celebrates their campaigning against Section 28, which were Thatcher-era restrictions on local authorities, and therefore schools, about the promotion of homosexuality, which is interesting for him to celebrate when he's on the front line of delivering the first anti-LGBTQ+ legal frameworks since then. He also regularly attacked his former employer. Now, I'm not going to get too deep on Stonewall and its position in the community at large, but I will say that there is a bit of a trend in the UK to NGOify fighting for civil rights, and it cannot be surprising in that context that a charlatan like Streeting, with his Cambridge education and his NUS presidency, found his way in. Finally, he does get into elected politics because he was a councillor before he was an MP. He was on Redbridge Council, a council and a local Labour Party that has been controversial, let's say. The important thing here is that he rose through the ranks quite quickly and became Jas Atwell, the council leader at the time's deputy. Jas Atwell is also the MP who is in essence a slumlord who ran a failing children's home, which was given money by the council he was leader of. Which, you know, seems fine, actually. This relationship seems to have been instrumental in his rise to become an MP. After all, it's hard to be noticed, so I imagine the assistance of the slumlord was helpful. As a fun little ending, he does also name-check Mike Gapes, whose name, it's important to note, is a complete sentence, but also does come up later, weirdly. He name-checks him as a friend, and, well, long-time viewers will know we love Mike Gapes around here. We just fucking love that guy.
I'm Mike Gapes, the Member of Parliament for...
To summarise this book and Wes before he was an MP, this book is not good. I can't recommend it. While on paper his background and his trajectory is compelling, a lot of it isn't really about him, but about people around him, which, given he was 39 when he published it, cannot be a big surprise. There are some interesting tidbits in there, but only if you're already familiar with him, which speaks to who this is really for. It's a tough read, not really because of the quality of the writing in and of itself, but because Wes has so little to say to someone who isn't already on his side. There's no attempt to connect the dots. It's like if BoJack Horseman wrote his own book instead of getting a ghostwriter. Which, by the way, Wes Streeting insisted on writing this himself. He insisted on writing the worst biography in history. And I'm not exaggerating, it's that bad. Which leads to the emergence of two Wes Streetings from this book, and from his life before he was an MP. There's the Wes Streeting he wants to present to his colleagues in the press and in politics, that of a man who's had to pull themselves out of the gutter with help, but who understands this to be a function of their own hard work and latent talents being brought out, as opposed to what it really is, which is a function of good luck. There are plenty of people from disadvantaged backgrounds, hell, even more advantaged backgrounds, who didn't have the opportunities he did, and there are even more now. He is presenting himself as the successful product of the welfare state, but decries its cruelty. He talks about how his mum was treated by hospital staff, but doesn't sit with his own future role in reproducing those attitudes. I think if there's one thing that could have made the book good, it would be him actually using this to reflect rather than aggrandize himself, both by borrowing the valor of his working class relatives and by touting his escape as down to his brilliance. Then there's the Wes Streeting that actually emerges from this book. One that is vain, that views the hardships he dealt with as tests of his character, and having passed them, understands this as making him not just lucky, but worthy. It paints the picture of a man so thoroughly captured by the elite institutions he fought to get into that there's a refusal to engage with what he sometimes states plainly. This is a person who fundamentally feels like he's in it for himself and who feels like his mission is to acquire political power for the sake of having it. He claims it's to help people like himself and frames this as people who grew up in the conditions I did. But he means it more literally. He wants to help people like his present self. He's not lying as such. He's just so thoroughly bought into his own hype, he can't see past it. With his pre-parliamentary life out of the way, we can get into the good stuff. It's important to understand how different the Parliamentary Labour Party Wes entered was compared to other ones elected in the post-war era. For one, it lacked a significant Scottish contingent. Labour in 2015 was reeling from a defeat that appeared much more severe because of the loss of all but one of its Scottish seats. Edinburgh South, held by Ian Murray, a man who looks like a boiled egg that's had pubes glued on it. Yeah, that guy's probably never going to lose his seat ever, and keep an eye on it in case Wes does become Prime Minister. I'm just saying. Not only was the PLP he entered distinctly more dominated by England, but it was also smaller and much less powerful. Had Wes Streeting been elected at almost any previous election, the PLP would have had the strong Scottish contingent and would have had disproportionate influence over who became the leader of the party. For example, had he been elected in 2010, as well as being able to control who was nominated alongside his colleagues, his vote in the leadership contest would have been equal to about 475 regular members of the party, giving him a lot more power than some might think he should have. Instead, he was elected in 2015 when MPs only really had the power to filter who was on the ballot and didn't have this disproportionate voting power as the party had moved to one member, one vote, which means that the wishes of the parliamentary party could more easily be circumvented. There's a whole bunch of arguments about whether this was good or bad, and these all happened at the time, but we'll gloss over that and say, yes, the wishes of the PLP were circumvented, and a leader they didn't agree with was imposed on them by the membership. For someone who I think clearly fancied themselves a rising star like Streeting did, I don't think that went down well, not least because Parliament operates on a patronage system. If you don't align or at least accommodate the views of the leader, your career would go nowhere, at least in Parliament. And poor Wes found himself having nominated and supported Liz Kendall, who you might know as the woman leading the charge against disabled people, but back then was most famous for getting 4.5% in the 2015 leadership election, a vote share so embarrassing that it really should have been used as grounds to remove her as a candidate at the next election if she didn't decide to voluntarily quit from the shame. Regardless, this left Wes with no real way to progress in Parliament, especially as a newly elected MP. Being a bag carrier for a frontbencher, which is the traditional early career advancement, was closed off to him. Though he was on the Treasury Committee as soon as he got into Parliament, so all was not lost. But let's be honest, the general public do not give a shit about the committees. So what's an ambitious young guy like Wes to do? He could have focused on being a good constituency MP who got out into the community he represented and tried to coexist with the leadership that wasn't to his particular ideological liking and expressed his dissatisfaction in private, or by voting against his party's whip in a principled way. you know, the thing that the guy who won that leadership election did throughout his career. Reading that book, you do see that Wes wants to be seen as a principled freethinker who tells it how it is. Admittedly, he's trying to do that on behalf of certain groups rather than by learning from them, but it's there if you read between the lines a little bit. Instead, he decided to catapult himself into the media spotlight. A lot of the 2015 intake of Labour MPs ended up getting national press attention a lot sooner than they might otherwise have. Typically, a backbench MP doesn't find themselves in the press too often, but Wes, as I said, seems to enjoy the attention, so he found the way. From 2015 to 2020, there were a few ways the 2015 intake could get a lot of attention. First, after the PLP's attempt to oust its leader failed, a lot of inexperienced MPs were promoted to high-profile shadow cabinet positions, just due to there being a shallow bench of the willing. You could think of 2020 leadership candidates Rebecca Long-Bailey and Keir Starmer as examples of this, though with different degrees of enthusiasm. The alternative route to prominence for a lot of the 2015 intake was, and there's not really an elegant way to describe this, shit-talking their own party, and in particular the leader who they felt had been imposed on them by a membership they fundamentally resented. You can put MPs like Jess Phillips, Stella Creasy, and the subject of this video, Wes Streeting, in this category. Malcontents who were rewarded for their tantrums with positive press, which was usually couched in terms of, you know, unelectability initially. And then when 2017 happened, and that turned out not to be a very strong argument, suddenly it became about major policy differences, particularly around foreign policy and nationalisation and spending, which we can translate as austerity and doing big wars, and a moral obligation to oppose the leadership on many grounds, some of which we will get into later. I do want to say that for a leader he disagreed with on so much, Wes Streeting didn't really rebel much in the Commons, and I get that an overwhelming majority of the votes and legislation presented to Parliament would have been Tory legislation, so perhaps they united over their distaste for Tory policy, but he racked up only 3 noteworthy rebellions against the Labour whip under Jeremy Corbyn, one of which is really interesting. It was the vote to remove Mike Gapes and Ian Austin from their committee places after they defected from Labour. I'd say that if you're supposed to be some great politician, big thinker, big brain, you'd find more than 3 things to disagree with the jam man about, and less than 33% of those disagreements should be about him being mean to your reactionary besties. Though I would say that does summarize a lot of the objections people like Wes had. It was about the gravy train being stopped, though a lot of the complaining Wes did happened outside of the Commons. A good example of the kind of battles people like Wes Streeting picked is, perhaps rather funnily, about McDonald's. Cast your minds back to 2016. The Labour Party had decided to refuse £30,000 from McDonald's to set up a stall at their conference. This did not go down well with Wes Streeting, who immediately ran to the press alongside another former McDonald's employee, Ian Austin. That name again showing up. It's just don't ask about Ian Austin's relationships with dogs. That's all I'm gonna say. But here's the quote. I'm exasperated that we should throw away £30,000 worth of sponsorship like this. It smacks of a snobby attitude towards fast food restaurants and people who work or eat at them. McDonald's may not be the trendy falafel bar that some people in politics like to hang out at, but it's enjoyed by families across the country. Fucking hell, what is it I'm doing with my life reading this shit? Now, there's a lot going on here. At the time, a union affiliated with Labour, the Bakers Food and Allied Workers Union, was trying to get recognition from McDonald's. This decision wasn't made by the leader, but by some subcommittee, which he wasn't even on. And it was made on paper out of solidarity to put pressure on McDonald's to recognise them. Instead, you get the impression that Jeremy Corbyn was some kind of snob because he prefers falafel, which, to be honest, isn't a posh person's food. Like, you can just go to a Lebanese place here and get it pretty cheap compared to McDonald's, and that he's somehow profligate in rejecting £30,000. The truth is that because he swelled the party's membership, the party could more easily show this solidarity because they more than made up for it with the membership fees he brought in. Is any of this the main focus across the press? No. Instead, you get a Labour MP getting favourable headlines in right-wing publications because apparently eating McDonald's is an essentially working-class trait. In a way, it's kind of the perfect thing for Wes Streeting to be getting involved in, being as he is a true student politician. Total small-time nonsense, purely about posturing and eking out a rhetorical victory, which usually detonates upon any examination. The fact that he was rewarded with exactly what he wanted for this rather sloppy work, and it has real see me after class vibes, speaks to the wider issue, which was that you didn't even need to have a point to get this kind of coverage. You could just say any old shite and you would get it published by a journalist, which some would say is bad early career preparation for someone who wanted to be a prominent politician on the front bench. Governing and holding a government to account is about more than finding a total non-issue and getting it blown up because you have friends who are journalists or you're helping to feed the narrative they prefer. You actually have to want to do something. It doesn't have to be good, but just something other than selling out for £30,000. Though, as we'll see, he sells out for rather more than that these days, so I guess he learned something. It's impossible to talk about the ways in which politicians who were in Wes Streeting's position, on the outside looking in, got media attention without talking about the protracted controversy about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, which Wes Streeting commented on well before it had become a sort of mainstream media narrative after the 2017 election. Gee, I wonder why they suddenly decided to look into it then. Isn't it curious how that played out? This is something that to this day still creates some passionate responses, and there has been a lot of documentary evidence and outright admissions now that there was a significant element of this that was weaponized for political purposes, and that there had been a deliberate campaign of sabotage in the processing of complaints. There's a whole leaked report about this, and an Al Jazeera documentary called The Labour Files that covers a lot of this. If you want to find out more, that stuff is out there. Now, that isn't to say that when Wes Streeting intervened on this issue, as he did many times, that he was wholly cynical. But in doing so, he aligned with cynics. Of particular note was his open support for the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which has been used to curtail criticism of Israel and to conflate that criticism with anti-Semitism. Some would say that is itself a conflation that doesn't do anyone any favors. I'm just saying. It was also never really intended to be used as like a code of conduct or like a legal framework. This issue had become a long-running saga, and Wes Streeting absolutely exploited it to enhance his own reputation, a theme that becomes a recurrence on this issue. One of the earliest instances of this was his attack on Shami Chakrabarti, who authored an early report on anti-Semitism in Labour, whose recommendations were deliberately prevented from being implemented by the right-wing General Secretary of the party. His attack was that by accepting a peerage, she had undermined her report's validity, which, I mean, I don't really see how a report that was critical could lead to a reward. Have you ever heard of that sort of thing? It rather seems like the leadership valued a skilled voice, but Wes does have a bit of form with attacking women of colour on this issue. One particularly funny incident, if you want to call it that, was when he accused Dawn Butler, at the time running for deputy leader, of including a policy to ensure the political independence of the EHRC, which, seems fatally compromised now to a lot of people, but was at the time, given their politically motivated investigation of Labour, in the Race and Faith Manifesto, as intended to undermine efforts to tackle anti-Semitism. Now, on paper, this looks like a slam dunk, doesn't it? a left-aligned MP writing a left-aligned manifesto wanted to alter the political alignment of the organisation investigating the left-led party. Only if Wes Streeting actually gave a shit about either this issue or cared about the basic facts, he'd know that this was in the 2017 manifesto he was elected on before the investigations even began. So it looks like he's weaponizing the issue to slander another woman of colour. Isn't it curious? This will not be the last time I mention him having an issue with a woman of colour, by the way. Now, I did say that he found himself on the same side as cynics, and I have no real proof that he knew about the scale of the cynicism involved in manufacturing this crisis, as people like to call it. But he did have one very telling run-in with one of the people who led the charge on this issue. He told one of the campaigners, a man named Ewan Phillips, to fuck off, which I think does tell us that there were degrees to which people were committed to a partisan hackery on the topic. One of the more interesting aspects of this is he seems to be familiar with Ewan, and I wonder just how much he knew about his operation. One interesting example is in the Al Jazeera documentary, The Labour Files. In the second episode, it was revealed that he used a fake name to submit complaints, calling himself David Gordstein, which feels like a good point to say that neither Ewan Phillips nor Wes Streeting are Jewish, which characterizes a lot of the debate, which was that it was white British people arguing about something without really engaging with anyone who was actually materially impacted by it. This leans into something else about Wes Streeting we'll talk about a bit later in this section, which is that he just cannot stop himself from being really weird online. Like, he loves picking fights with activists and members of the public, which, back when he was an activist and member of the public, was fine. Who cares? But he's done it as an MP. Another place where he may well have been sincere and there was a spectrum of intents but was aligned with cynics was his support of the People's Vote campaign and his general Remainer instincts. Now, I get a lot of people felt and feel strongly about this, but it's kind of obvious now that membership of the EU was used as a wedge issue by the right of both Labour and more generally in British politics. I want to say that if you were a People's Vote person, not one of the people like at the top or involved in the organisation, but, you know, out on their admittedly very annoying marches with the dogs and the annoying signs, I don't think you were a cynic necessarily, but you might want to look into where some of the top figures associated with that and the adjacent campaigns have ended up. Or indeed where they came from and the things they've said about what their real concern was. Concerns which you might have shared, but let me ask you this. Is the diamond hard Brexit we got what you wanted? Would you do anything differently if you had the chance to do it again? Anyway, that's an aside to pick up another day. The Leave victory in the 2016 referendum and the leadership's alleged indifference and inability or unwillingness to lead Remain to victory was used as justification for a coup attempt. It won't surprise you to know that Wes Streeting backed it and bought into the usual lines that the leadership didn't put enough effort in to ensure victory. Despite Wes Streeting having retweeted and then later deleting the retweet an image showing that same leader campaigning for Remain, and the fact that he was one of the most covered pro-Remain figures during the campaign by the press, and that the actual organising wing of Labour's Remain campaign was run by Alan Johnson, a figure from the party's right, who weirdly escaped all blame for the loss, while his faction was committing sabotage, apparently. Now, this failed rather famously, and Wes and his mates declared after this that their opposition would be implacable. In fact, here's the quote: "I've no intention of changing, no platitudes, and no pretense that the concerns I had yesterday about the state of our party and its leadership don't still hold today or won't concern me tomorrow." Which I might not agree with, but it is at least in theory a principled position. But no matter the democratic mandate, no matter the scale of support demonstrated, you just don't agree and don't think anything worthwhile can come from this leadership. You'll never guess what happened next. When the dust had settled on the 2017 election, I think it's reasonable to say that there was a lot of surprise. I don't remember a lot about that night because I'd had rather a lot of vodka by a certain point, as was my style at the time. For the political class, the shock was severe, especially among those implacable opponents of Jeremy Corbyn, like Wes Streeting. For someone who struck such a determined note less than a year before the election, he suddenly had a much more conciliatory attitude and tone. Suddenly there were calls to unite. Corbyn had earned the right to lead the party, as if the democratic mandate from the members wasn't the only thing that gave him that right. Streeting even made an appearance on Novara Media. I was sure I hallucinated that, but no, this footage is real, and it's really interesting that this happened at all. It's kind of sad that it happened around like EU Brexit-y stuff, but still interesting. Now, I have no evidence to make a connection between Streeting's change of heart and the now well-documented plot orchestrated by Morgan McSweeney, a veteran of Liz Kendall's 4.5% campaign in 2015 and now Starmer's chief of staff, to pose as smilingly compliant with Corbynism while actively destroying it. Given that he is widely considered McSweeney's preferred candidate to succeed Starmer, and that some have made the connection between the briefings against women members of the cabinet and a concerted effort to position Streeting as the heir apparent, I find it hard to believe he knew nothing. Especially when journalists were invited to a presentation in like 2018 explaining this exact plan. If it was just a coincidence that he followed the exact lines as needed for this task, which is possible, I can see why McSweeney would want Streeting. If not, then it's just another example of him being a perfect student politician who doesn't really care about anything. Beyond that, though, I do wonder if someone who has the interpersonal issues, let's call it that Streeting has, should be considered a potential Prime Minister, and what that says about what his time in Parliament has revealed about him. Something that has become a bigger and bigger part of the political discourse over the past 10 to 15 years has been social media. Both how MPs are received on it and how they react to criticism. The general answer is they've not coped well with it. And to be honest, that's a rare instance where the political class has aligned with us. I don't think anyone is doing great with social media. It's just that me having the odd bad day where I get a bit short-tempered with someone is a bit different from an elected representative. As a member of the public, I have much less responsibility. No one elected me to anything, and I'm not anybody's representative. I'm just me. So if I tell you to fuck off, it doesn't really have any real weight other than what you give it. But when a member of parliament is highlighting people who want to deselect him and saving their deleted tweets, it's a little harassment-y for my tastes. For all the anytime a left-winger quotes me, it's a vicious pile-on stuff that centrists love to do, Wes does love a scrap online, and I think this predates his time in Parliament, as his spat with Clive Lewis showed, but he carried it into office and into his frontbench career, which you can see from this incident where he responded to someone criticising him for his transphobic policies as health secretary by insisting this member of the public get a grip, which I think is such a good summary of how the political class in this country don't think their job is to represent us or to respond to public pressure, but to hold us accountable for our excesses. This tendency towards inappropriate and aggressive conduct also extended towards his colleagues. It was reported in something that he challenged but was later found to have no factual inaccuracies, that he shouted in the face of Diane Abbott, an MP who at the time received around 50% of all abuse being sent to MPs, having clashed with her in Parliament before an incident where he apparently screamed "not my party" in her face and had to be, escorted away. We will note that he seems to be using the issue of anti-Semitism to attack a woman of colour here. If it weren't so grim, I'd say its recurrence merits a drinking game. This abusive attitude towards colleagues was not punished, at least not by anyone that matters, since he, as I said, carried it into his frontbench career, which resulted in him having to apologise for calling another member of parliament senile, which, you're the shallow health secretary. People who suffer from these issues are going to be dependent on you doing your job well. isn't isn't this cool? Isn't all of this so cool? Still, he apologized, so I guess we can't hold it against him. Funny how that only applies to some people, I suppose. This seems like a good time to move on to his frontbench career, where he's taken these lessons he's learned and applied them for evil. Just lots of fucking evil shit that everyone hates. With the 2019 election, there was a leadership election, and contrary to our worst fears, Wes Streeting didn't run. He did support Jess Phillips for leader, which continues his fantastic record of always supporting the most obnoxious option at every internal election. Jess Phillips didn't win, spoiler alert, but Keir Starmer did, and he finally took this underused talent off the bench and threw him into some junior shadow ministries. Now I'm gonna be brutally fucking honest with you all. No one gives a shit about what Wes Streeting did as Shadow Minister for Schools, or the 6 months he spent as Shadow Secretary of State for Child Poverty, though presumably he was in favour of child poverty when he held the post, and after, to be honest. What people really care about is his frontbench career as the Shadow and later the actual Health Secretary. As Shadow Health Secretary and in government, the overwhelming attitude Wes Streeting has displayed is that the NHS is unduly treated like a sacred cow and that it should instead be sacrificed, presumably so that the mysterious healthcare deities that have forsaken us might return us to their favour. He does seem to harbour a dislike towards the NHS, attacking it as an institution, wishing to withhold necessary funding until reforms are made. At least that's what the Prime Minister said, and because Wes Streeting hasn't resigned about it, I think we can associate him with those comments. Now, for those of us who have been around the block a few times, we know what reform usually means. It's more private involvement, usually alongside a reorganisation of the NHS's staffing and organisational structure. That doesn't really change anything, and it means cuts, which no one wants for the NHS other than people who oppose universal healthcare. This is made more problematic by the fact that I'm unclear if Wes Streeting understands the point of universal healthcare, or how any healthcare actually works. He makes various odd and unhelpful interventions, such as his comment that GPs should prioritise the elderly over the young, as if like GPs couldn't possibly understand how to prioritise patients or anything like that. I'm not saying GPs are perfect, but my guess is they have that under control. He has no experience working in healthcare. Now that isn't a barrier to heading the department because you can go and listen to people. I just don't think that's his strength, especially because of his attitudes towards the workers in the NHS who would, by and large, know the ins and outs of how fucked it is. This attitude is best characterized as oppositional. He seems to think that doctors and nurses, their unions and their interests are his enemies. They're things to be defeated. He regularly, both in opposition and in government, has attacked the unions that represent doctors and nurses. He's opposed strike action. He's even misrepresented why the BMA, the union that represents doctors, opposes certain reforms he and the Tories have proposed, which is funny because that's what a certain YouTuber I did a video about did as well. Weird. He has regularly claimed that doctors' strikes aren't in the interests of patients, which has what I'd call face validity until you realize that it's perhaps not in patients' best interests to be treated by underpaid, overworked staff. My job is not that stressful, and the chance that someone would die if I made a mistake is minimal, though they did bring it up during some of my training. Medical professionals have a lot more responsibility than I ever will. For the quality of life or even the ongoing life of others. If you keep making their conditions and pay worse, then they'll leave. We've seen this with Australia targeting our doctors for employment, and well, would you rather be paid well and live in Australia or suffer wage suppression and live in the UK? Anyway, this video has been brought to you by the Australian healthcare system, who have no, this video is not sponsored by anyone because no one in their right mind would sponsor any video I do. Go to Patreon, patreon.com/SKTheCrusader. Please He's regularly engaged in unhelpful hyperbole, claiming recently that a junior doctor strike would put the NHS in jeopardy, when it's a decade and a half of austerity and decades of creeping privatization that's been doing that just fine. The NHS has survived many strikes, and I suspect it will survive many more. It sounds, as Wes Streeting put it when he accused Rishi Sunak of being happy with the strikes, like he's looking for excuses for his own failures. He even steals the language of trade unionism, claiming to want to be a shop steward for patients, which is a pretty grotesque thing when you consider that the underlying justification for withholding pay rises for staff is to put that money elsewhere within the NHS. The thing is, you can put as much money as you want into something. If the staff either don't exist or are too exhausted to use the resources provided to them, then it means jack shit. The NHS absolutely has problems. I'm not trying to detract from that, whether it's the relatively poor outcomes on cancer treatments, or the seasonal crises it suffers every winter, or the fact that accessing care is sometimes really fucking hard, especially if you're from a marginalized community. The thing is, the first step to solving a lot of, not all, but a lot of these problems is to just pay doctors what they're worth, to stop encouraging them to move into the private sector where we pay them for the same thing but with an outrageous markup. No shade on those doctors. Get your bag. If you can get that money, go nuts. But you shouldn't be put in a position where that's an attractive route for you. He regularly supports the use of the private sector to alleviate the NHS and help with waiting times. On the surface, it's got a, if you've got 'em, smoke 'em type logic to it. It's there. Why not use it? Setting aside that when we get a doctor to do private NHS stuff, it's the same doctors that we would otherwise have in the NHS, but we pay a lot more for them. There isn't a massive spare capacity out there. It's mostly just the same capacity. I could see the argument though. Let's use this as a stopgap while we patch things up behind the scenes. That would require there to be any patching up, which there isn't. It's all about accelerating reforms. It's about cuts. It's about outsourcing and just giving more and more and more to private healthcare. Sure, you may not pay for it up front, but someone's profiting from it, which makes the fact that he gets, in general, an outrageous amount of donations, but specifically more than 60% of his accepted donations are from individuals or companies with ties to private healthcare. Look, I've had to say this before in the second Keir Starmer video. I'm not saying his opinions or his policies are being unduly influenced, but I think it's a stretch to say that this has no impact at all, insofar as capitalism is a system that we've agreed to live under, which I don't think a lot of us have, but here we go. You can't tell me that providing large sums of the exchange mechanism within that system doesn't impact anything. Like, I give up 8 hours of my time on Monday to Friday because they give me money to do it. Wes is receiving single donations larger than my annual salary. It's entirely possible, in fact, I would say probable, that he was already pro-privatization and the donations are to, help him in that aim, rather than to change his mind. But it is a striking amount he's received. I'll leave it there for now. Wes, as part of his plan for the NHS, is really leaning on AI as a big problem solver. Now, I want to be clear that AI doesn't just mean the plagiarism machine that boils away lakes. I'm led to believe that some forms of it can have medical applications, particularly in some diagnostics. The critical thing about this is it still involves human oversight, and there is a human decision maker who can be made accountable. This information comes from a channel called Pivot to AI, who's a smaller channel, and credit to them. The NHS, and therefore Wes Streeting, is imposing transcription AIs on GPs. The idea being that it will listen to your conversation with the GP and will provide an accurate transcript. Apparently, according to Pivot to AI, it's quite good at this, but still needs human oversight. Mistakes can be made by the AI. If these mistakes are made, then the liable party might be the doctor themselves. Now, there's a very good argument to be made that if you entrust the AI as a professional, that you have made a decision that means you should be held liable. In fact, they seem to suggest that trusts seek legal advice before using this software. But this is being imposed on them. There's no decision, apparently. At least that's what I'm understanding. Now, this is really bad. I don't think you should unleash this into the world, especially because this highlights that the machine cannot be held accountable, which is a dangerous thing to signal when the government is proposing AI assistant for GPs and doctors. Again, I'm not saying there's no applications, and it's perhaps unfortunate that generative AI, which plagiarizes, has dominated this conversation. So whenever I say the word, you're polarized in a direction one way or the other. But it is nonetheless concerning, especially when 1 in 4 patients report that there are errors in their medical records. The slot machine may well pump those numbers up, and I think it's irresponsible to rely heavily on this as a strategy. I want to be clear, Wes Streeting has not said AI will fix everything, but he and the department he leads seem very keen on it. And it's something to be aware of, especially since there doesn't seem to be the usual, gradual rollout you might expect for something like this. Then we come to what I think are ethical issues with his management of healthcare. I believe that it's important that the person in charge of the NHS politically at least be reasonably aware of medical ethics and basic material reality. There are 3 areas I want to touch on. 2 of them will be shorter and just quick examples. 1 of them will be a longer look because it has become, unfortunately, the issue. Firstly, let's return to this idea of giving weight loss jabs to the unemployed that we talked about in the intro. Jibes about the picture choice aside, when I say this to you, doesn't it make you feel a little uneasy? Because it should. It's a vision of healthcare that sees its role as increasing your value to capitalists. The implication of this is that some people could be compelled to use these drugs in exchange for benefits. That was the initial impression that was given when this policy was floated, which was why we got that very funny denial. And to be honest, it's not really a very strong denial of that being the case. Refer to my SDFU video about benefits for a fuller explanation, but this fits into a pattern of seeking to deny people support that they need. There's also the great big honking ethical issue, which is that this is inherently coercive and therefore unethical. See, I think, and maybe this is a controversial position now, that if you're going to have a medical intervention, it should only be done with your informed consent, where you're made aware of the risks and can reasonably say no. Under this arrangement, with it specifically being tied to being unemployed, can you say no? Even if it's not the explicit policy, we're kind of getting into because of the implication territory here. Then there are his comments about mental health issues being overdiagnosed, which is just... I can't say it politely. What kind of fucking prick do you have to be to believe this in the UK? Anyone who suffered and tried to seek help for mental health issues and conditions can tell you it's fucking hard to get a diagnosis. It's just not a reflection of reality. This feeds into a generalized atmosphere in the UK, stigmatizing those who can't work because of mental health issues. Again, the benefits SDFU video is a good one here. He's playing along those lines, and it's irresponsible. Given the way he deployed senility as a weapon in Parliament, one might suggest a pattern of behaviour here that doesn't bode well. Overdiagnosed or not, which it's not by the way, it's his responsibility to craft policy to provide for the medical needs of those who have these issues. This is borderline RFK Jr.'s position, an idea that these diagnoses aren't based on something real. Now, I'm not saying he's going to be sending everyone with ADHD to a work camp, but it's still not exactly great, is it? That he's comparable to a guy who had a worm eat his brain. Now we come to the big issue with Wes Streeting as health secretary, and as a high-profile politician, he's at the front line of the current assault on trans rights. This is despite him having been at least publicly, supportive figure of trans people and having worked for Stonewall, a fact he deploys to bolster his attacks on trans people. It's somewhat interesting to me, actually, that he was so pro-trans before, at least relatively speaking, because the faction of the Labour Party he belonged to were actually not terrible on this issue once upon a time. Context matters. We're talking about the 2000s and the early mid-2010s when I say that, so I'm not saying they had like a perfect understanding or anything like that. They did seem to have a sincerity about them as the socially liberal wing of the Labour right. In fact, Wes Streeting's turn, as it were, where he's tried to get others to apologise for being correct on the issue, as well as his faction's turn, is made all the more ugly by this. Because for all of their attempts to drive wedges between Keir Starmer's predecessor as leader and his support base, they never hit upon this issue, which is both to be expected but a little odd, because there were transphobes in and around the Corbyn project, and they absolutely could have been used to drive a decent-sized wedge between him and his internal support. They didn't, partially because they had aligned with transphobes themselves, although on other issues they aligned with racists, so I don't see why that slowed them down, actually. And I think partially because they didn't really care. It was a part of the uniform to be relaxed about the issue. If someone walked up to you with a sign that says trans rights are human rights, yeah, take a picture with them. It's what you do. Until, of course, it's not, and you begin to transform your politics to follow a mythical, largely non-existent centre ground. Now, I'm reluctant to make this point, but I've seen it said that it's known that Wes Streeting is part of, like, an evangelical conversion therapy supporting church, and I've tried looking for something solid that I could wave in your face about that. I couldn't. I could find a lot of articles about him reconnecting with his faith, and he was religious earlier in his life according to the biography. I'm going to chalk this one up to a limitation on my end. If you do have something solid about this that I've missed, please share it. Regardless, I don't want people to think I believe that just because he's a Christian or religious or attends church that his views have been warped by that. If it is true that he's attending a conversion therapy supporting church, then, you know, obviously that's different, right? I get it, that's different. And it would also not be massively out of step with the conduct of his party leader who visits churches with those kinds of connections, especially opposition to equalities legislation. So it's possible, but I didn't find it, which might just be my fault. See, I'm throwing up the bat signal. If you have something, please share it with the class. If not, that's fine. It's like not like I could find it. I've also seen it suggested that he's always hated trans people, but again, that seems anecdotal. I'm not saying it's not true, but just to contextualize why I'm framing it as a change. In public, his expressed attitude has shifted to the point that he's demanded David Tennant, the guy who plays Doctor Who, that he apologized to Kemi Badenoch for telling her to shut up, which she should, especially about trans people. Shut up, Kemi Badenoch. If Wes is watching, I hope that made you cry, you fucking baby. He's also lied about trans people over and over, and he's particularly relevant, he's lied about trans doctors. Specifically, he claimed that transitioning allows doctors to wipe away their, like, misconduct records, which is not true at all, because of course it's not fucking true. They get a new ID number, but the history is transferred to it, like a rational system, and it's odd that he felt the need to lie about this. I couldn't find any instances of him correcting himself or apologizing, so we'll have to leave that there. If that exists, also please do correct me. He's also met with pro-conversion therapy groups, including Bayswater. Quick content warning here, this is not going to be nice, by the way. Who have talked in their private forums about things like cutting off trans children from supportive friends and planning to put chili sauce in mascara so that presumably when the child uses it, it's irritating and it burns. He expressed sympathy with these groups' experiences, saying, having met with Bayswater parents, I think that's been I'd go as far as to say traumatic experience for some of those families, and that's really stuck with me. Now, I'm not saying that they told him about what they got up to in their little Discord, but what the fuck, man? It's clear he has political sympathy for these people, as well as personal sympathy. He blocked puberty blockers for trans children while allowing cis children to still use them on the grounds that it was particularly risky in some fashion for trans children. And being frank, I think what he means is the risk is that they might be trans and choose to express that. There's this whole thing about not wanting kids to go through the wrong puberty and not make mistakes because of medical intervention, but blocking puberty blockers is an intervention that makes that more likely. He's tried to offer on occasion these sort of softer moments where he says he's sorry for things, but he never changes the policies. Plus, these apologies always take the form of, I'm sorry you feel that way, which is not a proper apology if you ask me. He's even suggested that trans people could be given private rooms in the NHS as part of their segregation following the Supreme Court ruling. There aren't any private rooms on the NHS anywhere. Like, you've seen to that, Wes. This is a policy that's geared towards scaring trans people from seeking treatment and designed to stoke resentment against them. 10 out of 10. No notes, Wes, you transphobic fuck. I don't want to spend a lot of time talking about this because it upsets me, clearly, but it's clear that Wes Streeting is a transphobe and is taking every opportunity to enact those policies, particularly targeting children, which, to be clear, makes him one of the most pathetic people in Britain. Big bad Wes Streeting, he loves to attack children, but only if he has the might of the British state behind him. What a fucking joke he is, honestly. One consequence of his high profile and his clinging to the Labour Party's official line, especially as it related to Palestine and Israel's escalating genocide, is it made him a target. Sure, there were MPs and candidates who were more openly pro-Israel, but it's worth noting he did get some big donations from pro-Israel donors. Regardless, his high profile, closeness to a leader devoted to Israel, and the fact that he was just known as an anti-left figure who was clearly right-wing on the NHS meant his local community wanted to put up a challenger to him. Enter Leanne Mohammed, at the time a 23-year-old British Palestinian woman. Under normal circumstances, an independent candidate like her would collect a few hundred votes and just be a little sort of like note on the Wikipedia page for that constituency. Instead, she came within a few hundred votes of beating him, which makes her one of the most successful independent candidates at the last election, and she deserves full credit for it, as do the people who campaigned for her. I'm not being patronizing, it's actually an impressive accomplishment all around for everyone involved. It's also the subject of some questions, like how could such a senior politician almost be upended like this? Now, I've not been able to find footage of it, but apparently he gave a real sore winner speech at the count, blaming a divisive campaign and all sorts of things, kind of John Ashworth. It's John Ashworth stuff. He's also taken to the radio with that explanation, blaming a deep fake for his troubles, among other things. Yeah, look, he's doing the John Ashworth thing. He's crying about non-issues that wouldn't have impacted him if he hadn't been so close to a pro-genocide leadership. Ultimately, though, the fact that he went in this direction rather than recognizing community discontent with him and his party speaks to how pathetic he is. Fingers crossed he's out on his ass next time, especially if he's Prime Minister, because that will be very fucking funny. Despite all of this, he's currently considered the power behind the throne's Morgan McSweeney's preferred successor to Keir Starmer, including a campaign that seems to particularly target potential women challengers to that status, with a lot of briefings attacking them. This links back to a particular issue more generally with Starmer's project and women, but it is curious that Wes seems to be the main beneficiary here. In fact, he's begun to put the boot in about bad local election results. While not outright disavowing the policies that he claimed contributed to the result, he has subtly positioned himself as at least aware of the problem. Is he about to make his move? Is it time for the Wesreich? Maybe not, but given the death spiral Keir Starmer is clearly in, it's not impossible. His time is coming, and we need to ask ourselves some important questions about where this all leaves us if he is the next Prime Minister. I suppose all of this brings me to a question, especially in light of him clearly being the Irish Tory who's in control of Labour's most powerful faction's choice for Prime Minister. Is this the best we have? I think when Keir Starmer was presented to the public, very, very few people said, this guy is the absolute best we have. And to some extent, that could have been fine. You didn't need to be perfect to outperform the Tories. And yet here we are, talking about a potential replacement for him, and arguably this guy is even worse. A lot of people will tell you this man, this odd, thin-skinned, uncanny valley inhabiting man, is one of the best communicators in British politics. Isn't that fucking sad? Like, I'm a pessimist about Britain in a lot of ways, but it's insulting to suggest that this guy is the best we have to offer, either in terms of his communication skills, which require improvement, let's put it like that, as this final clip I'll show you of him attempting a joke illustrates.
On July the 4th.
Okay, I'm a bit confused about what you're doing about the backlog, because if I look at what Sir Keir Starmer said, he says that you're halving...
Someone died of it.
Sorry?
I said that's because you spent so much time on Diane Abbott. Let's get into the Labour's plan.
Oh, I see. That was a joke. Sorry, I missed that.
Or in terms of his politics, he doesn't have any, but in a more malicious way than Keir Starmer's apparent void where his ideology should be. He'll throw anyone and anything under the bus, no matter how vocally he supported them in the past. If he thinks there's a gain to be made from it, either electorally or personally, he'll do it. And in an environment where a far-right party has just swept away the two major parties at a local election, and the press prodding and trying to shithouse not just the usual culture war stuff, but anti-net zero stuff, do we want this sponge, this political plankton in charge? I think not, but it's not up to us for now. So for now, we have to content ourselves with knowing what this guy thinks, believes, and what he's done in the past. If I had to give you a message to take away from all of this, a lesson, is that Wes Streeting is, as Dawn Foster put it, a right-wing, lickspittle cunt. That's it. I need to thank my proofreader, who really, I really screwed because I made her read this, and it was very long and she had to read it in like an evening. So a special thanks to her. I also need to say, if you enjoyed my shirt with the contraption on it, you need to go check out Molto, whose link will be in the description. She's the one who made the shirt. It's very cool. I also need to thank the patrons and members. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. I appreciate all support, whether that's liking, commenting, subscribing, sharing the video. Please, it all helps. Please help me out by doing that. It doesn't cost you anything. The Patreon and membership does cost something, and a special thank you to them, particularly the top tier patrons: Drone Riff, Mercutio, Kersley Scheider, John N, Liron, and Carolyn. That list's getting a bit long these days. I'm pretty pleased with that. And our YouTube members: Nadir Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, Scaly Bubble, and Ben Johnson. Thank you to all of them. They are absolute legends. If you've made it this far into the video, you're an absolute legend. If you did enjoy it, like, comment, subscribe, all the good stuff, and I will catch you all on the next one. Hopefully a bit of a lighter video than this one. Take it easy, everyone. I'll catch you soon. Bye-bye.